He looked me dead in the eyes and said, "You're nothing but a poor old man." That sentence didn't just sting, it carved a wound meant to humiliate me, to strip away my dignity in front of everyone. Betrayal runs deepest, not when it comes from strangers, but when it comes from family. And that night, I realized silence could no longer protect me. Before we dive into today's story, I recommend you hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell, so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. If you enjoy this video, type 1 in the comments. If not, type 0 to let me know how I can make better content for you. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink, because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Frank Whitaker, and I am 62 years old. From the outside looking in, people see a quiet widower with silver hair, shoulders that slope from years of labor, and a pair of shoes with worn-down heels. They see my old Ford F-150 parked in the driveway, the kind of truck that rattles when you turn the ignition and squeaks when you brake at stoplights. They see a man who volunteers at church every Thursday night, bringing warm casseroles to the parish kitchen and chatting with folks who come in from the cold. What they don't see is the part of my life I've kept folded away, like letters tucked into a locked drawer. That hidden part is worth $30 million, though I've made sure no one outside my attorney and accountant knows it. I wasn't born wealthy. For decades, I worked with my hands as an HVAC technician, climbing ladders in the sweltering summers and freezing winters of Minneapolis. I carried toolboxes heavier than my lunch pail, patched leaky ducts, and replaced ancient boilers in basements that smelled of mildew. But I always had a fascination with computers. At night, after I came home coated in dust, I would sit at the desk Elaine bought from a thrift store and teach myself to code. The glow of the monitor lit up our small living room, while she sat nearby grading papers or knitting scarves. What began as a hobby turned into something far bigger when I realized maintenance schedules could be automated. Over the course of several years, I built a software program that streamlined the kind of work I did every day. It helped track repairs, schedule replacements, and generate reports for building managers. I tested it on my own jobs, then showed it to a couple of colleagues. Word spread slowly until one day, a regional property company adopted it across their entire portfolio. From there, it snowballed. I never advertised, never had a logo on billboards. I just kept refining it until, finally, a private equity group approached me with an offer. The number was staggering. I signed the papers, handed over the rights, and walked away with more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. Elaine, my wife, was the only one who knew the details. She was diagnosed with cancer not long after the deal closed. In the hospital, during the long nights when machines beeped softly and nurses moved quietly, she took my hand and made me promise something. "Keep your heart light and your wallet heavy where no one can see," she whispered. "Don't let money change the way people look at you. Live simply, live quietly." I promised, and I meant it. When she passed, that promise became sacred. I funneled most of the fortune into a protective trust under her name and set up North River Holdings to manage the rest. On the surface, I stayed the same man I had always been, modest, plain-spoken, driving the same truck and wearing the same jackets. My daughter Lena grew up with Elaine's warmth. She became an art teacher, full of compassion and sensitivity, the kind of woman who saved children's drawings like they were masterpieces. She married Dylan Cross, a real estate agent who thrived on noise, flashing lights, and Instagram reels. Where I found peace and silence, Dylan found fear. He disguised that fear with volume and shine, designer suits, expensive watches, and loud jokes at other people's expense. I saw through him, but Lena loved him, and I wanted to believe that love might settle his restless spirit. Dylan never missed a chance to mock my simplicity. He called my shoes antiques, laughed at the way I drove a truck older than their marriage, and once suggested I start a GoFundMe to upgrade my garage. When he introduced me to his colleagues, he'd say things like, "This is my father-in-law. He's old school, works hard, saves pennies." They chuckled, not knowing how far from the truth it was. My silence only reinforced his story. Without realizing it, I let his version of me take root in people's minds. The poor old man who needed his son-in-law's generosity. At first, I didn't mind. Pride had never been my compass. I thought, let them laugh. I know what's in my accounts. But as time passed, I noticed the looks. A neighbor offering me odd jobs to help out. Acquaintances asking if I needed part-time work to stay afloat. And even distant relatives whispering about how Lena married up. Dylan's arrogance wasn't just his own anymore. It was shaping how others treated me. Every Thursday evening, as I carried food into the church hall, I thought about Elaine's words, live quietly. But I also remembered the flicker of steel in her eyes whenever someone underestimated her. There was a storm gathering around me, and I could feel the pressure of it building in the air. I knew Dylan would eventually cross a line he couldn't retreat from. When that happened, my silence would no longer be protection. It would be surrender. For now, I kept my head low, folded my grief into my daily routines, and watched the man my daughter married strut around with borrowed feathers. But deep inside, where no one could see, I was preparing. Not out of vanity, not out of spite, but out of the conviction that one day, the truth would demand its stage. And when that day came, I would be ready to step into the light. The rooftop pulsed with music loud enough to make the glass railings vibrate. Neon lights painted the downtown Minneapolis skyline, and servers floated through the crowd with trays of cocktails that looked more like art projects than drinks. Dylan loved these sorts of nights, full of camera flashes, laughter that rang just a little too high, and investors eager to nod at every word he said. I stood near the edge of the roof, nursing a glass of water, my old jacket looking out of place among the tailored suits and glittering dresses. When Dylan grabbed the microphone, the crowd hushed, not out of respect, but out of anticipation. He was a showman. He raised his glass and launched into a speech about his latest real estate venture, bragging about square footage, property values, and how he had changed the skyline of Minneapolis one building at a time. The audience clapped at all the right beats, charmed by his confidence. Then he looked my way. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said with a grin, "this is my father-in-law, Frank. The hardest working man I know. He's so frugal, he makes Abraham Lincoln beg to get off the penny. The man won't even leave a tip at a diner. But don't worry, I take care of him." The laughter that followed was sharp, more like the sound of glass breaking than genuine amusement. A few guests exchanged glances, unsure if they should laugh or wince. I smiled faintly, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes, and lifted my glass in mock salute. Inside, I felt the air leave me in one long exhale. Dylan basked in the attention, pacing the stage like a ringmaster who had just cracked his whip. Later, as the music resumed, Lena slipped to my side. She was smiling, but her eyes betrayed her embarrassment. "Dad," she whispered, "don't take Dylan so seriously. He jokes too much when he's nervous." I nodded, though her words landed like stones. It wasn't just a joke, it was a seed. I could already feel it taking root. The days that followed confirmed it. A colleague of Dylan's approached me with a sympathetic smile and asked if I needed part-time work to stay busy. A neighbor offered to fix a broken section of my fence as a favor, though I hadn't asked for help. At church, a woman leaned close and murmured that she was praying for my stability, as if I were one step away from losing the roof over my head. These were not cruel gestures, but they were laced with an assumption that I was poor, dependent, and shrinking in the shadow of my successful son-in-law. I could hear Elaine's voice in the back of my mind, reminding me of the promise I made, to live quietly, to guard our fortune with silence. But there is a fine line between humility and surrender, and I began to sense I was drifting toward the latter. Dylan's voice was louder than my silence, and in a world that rewards noise, his version of me was becoming the truth. Then came the phone call from Ruth Delgado, my attorney. Her tone was calm, but beneath it I heard the ripple of urgency. "Frank," she said, "we've just been alerted to a loan application filed last week. It lists your home as collateral. The signature looks like yours, but it isn't. The notary who supposedly witnessed it had their license revoked 2 years ago. It's fraud. We've frozen any transaction, but you need to be aware. I sat at my kitchen table staring at the wood grain, as if it could explain how far Dylan was willing to go. My hand trembled slightly as I set the phone down. Until that moment, his insults had been words, humiliating but harmless. Now, it seemed he was reaching for something more dangerous, something that threatened not just my dignity, but my security. That night, I walked out to the garage. The air smelled of motor oil and dust, the familiar sense of decades spent working with my hands. I leaned against the old Ford and closed my eyes. Elaine had always said the truth has its own gravity, that sooner or later it pulls everything into alignment. I realized Dylan had crossed a line. He was no longer just a loud man puffing up his feathers. He had stepped into fraud, into betrayal, into territory that would demand an answer. As the garage light flickered overhead, I felt a calm clarity settle over me. The years of silence had protected me, but now they threatened to destroy me. I wasn't ashamed of being called poor. I was ashamed of letting a lie flourish without contest. Dylan had handed me no choice. I would have to speak, not in anger, but with proof and precision. I ran my hand along the truck's dented hood, as if Elaine might be there listening. "It's time," I whispered. For the first time in years, I felt the quiet of my life shift, not into chaos, but into resolve. The storm had broken, and I would no longer stand in its shadow. The ballroom shimmered with gold light from crystal chandeliers, the kind that made everything beneath them look more expensive than it truly was. Dylan had spared no expense for his charity gala, if it could be called that. There was a red carpet rolled across the entrance, a champagne fountain bubbling at the center of the hall, and a photographer's flash popping every other second. Guests in tuxedos and evening gowns drifted from table to table, balancing flutes of champagne and murmuring about property values, market forecasts, and who was investing in what. I sat at a corner table, hands folded over the program book, trying to blend into the noise. Dylan thrived in these spaces. He strutted across the stage like a man born to be adored. He tapped the microphone, cracked a joke about real estate prices that sent shallow laughter through the crowd, then launched into his performance about giving back to the community. He talked about his vision, his generosity, his ambition. Each word was polished to sound noble, though I recognized the undertone of vanity in every sentence. Then, with a flourish, he called my name. "Ladies and gentlemen, let's bring up my father-in-law, Frank Whitaker, the hardest working man you'll ever meet, and the most humble too." Applause rose as I stood, reluctant but unwilling to make a scene. I walked slowly toward the stage, my shoes clicking against the marble floor. At first I thought perhaps Dylan wanted to acknowledge me with some dignity, but when I reached the podium, I saw it, a glass jar with a label taped to the front. "Help Frank fix his truck." The words were scrawled in thick black marker, as though a child had written them. The laughter came in waves. Some chuckled lightly, unsure if they should. Others roared, slapping their knees. A few shifted in their seats, uncomfortable but silent. I felt the blood rush to my face, but I kept my expression calm. I smiled faintly, nodded once, and stepped back down. My hands were steady, but inside I felt the old furnace of shame burn hot. Dylan leaned into the microphone, milking the moment. "Don't worry, folks. We'll take good care of him. He's family." Another round of laughter echoed, this one more forced. I found my seat again, fixed my gaze on the tablecloth, and listened as Dylan continued his show, spinning himself as the generous provider. For the rest of the evening, he worked the room. I watched him move from table to table, leaning down to whisper in donors' ears. I knew what he was saying because I'd heard it before, that I was retired without a pension, that he supported not only his wife but me as well, that he was proud to carry the burden. He cloaked the humiliation in a veneer of charity, turning me into his personal parable of success compared to failure. I didn't eat the dinner that was served. The steak cooled on my plate, untouched. The music, the clinking of glasses, the applause for auctioned items, all of it blurred together into one long drone. My silence had given Dylan a canvas, and he was painting me in the ugliest colors he could find. When the evening finally ended, I left without a word. The night air was cold, biting through my jacket. I drove home in the old Ford, its engine growling against the highway's hum. I should have been numb, but instead I felt a dangerous clarity. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a call from Ruth Delgado, my attorney. Her voice was steady but urgent. "Frank, the investigation is complete. The loan application we discussed, it's fraudulent. The signature is a forgery, and the notary used has been disbarred. We've blocked the transaction for now, but it's serious. Whoever filed it was aiming to take your property." I closed my eyes, gripping the phone tighter. "It was Dylan," I said, though she hadn't named him. "Frank, we can't accuse without evidence. But the pattern, it points in his direction. We'll need to act carefully." The humiliation from the gala fused with the revelation of fraud into something sharper than anger: resolve. Dylan's insults had always been cheap entertainment for him, but this was different. He had stepped over a boundary. It wasn't just about mocking me anymore. It was about erasing me, stealing from me, rewriting my life as his own possession. That night, I sat in the garage again, the smell of motor oil wrapping around me like an old coat. I looked at the Ford, the very truck he had mocked, and I thought of Elaine. She would have hated seeing me humiliated. She would have told me that the truth, once revealed, doesn't need to shout. It just needs to stand. I realized then that the gala wasn't a celebration. It was a declaration of war. Dylan had thrown the first real blow, and he didn't even realize what he had started. I wasn't the old man he painted in front of the cameras. I was a man with the means, the evidence, and the will to fight back, and fight back I would. I decided to give Dylan one last chance to face me like a man. After the gala, after the forged loan, I told myself that maybe, just maybe, he would come to his senses if confronted privately. I chose a Sunday afternoon when I knew Lena would be home, thinking her presence might soften the edges. I drove the old Ford to their suburban house, its lawn trimmed with the precision Dylan demanded of everything people could see. The house itself was polished to look like a magazine cover, all glass and steel, but I knew its foundation was as hollow as Dylan's words. Lena opened the door with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She hugged me quickly, ushered me into the living room, and called for Dylan. He arrived minutes later, wearing a polo shirt with a luxury logo splashed across the chest, his grin wide and careless. He acted as if nothing had happened. "Frank," he said, settling into an armchair. "Good to see you. What's on your mind?" I stayed standing, holding the weight of my silence for a long moment before I spoke. "You humiliated me at the gala. You've been spreading lies about me. And now my attorney found a forged loan application with my name on it, using my house as collateral. That's not a misunderstanding, Dylan. That's fraud." The grin faltered for a moment, then returned, thinner. He waved a dismissive hand. "Come on, Frank. That jar was a joke. Nobody takes it seriously. You're blowing things out of proportion. And this loan business, what are you even talking about? Sounds like a clerical error, not me." Lena shifted uncomfortably on the couch. "Dad, maybe we should all calm down. Dylan's right. Sometimes things get exaggerated." I turned to her. "Lena, this isn't exaggeration. A forged signature isn't a joke. Someone is trying to steal from me, and all the signs point to your husband." Her face fell. She reached for Dylan's hand. "Dad, please. Don't create conflict where there doesn't need to be any. We just want peace." Peace, the word stung. For 7 years, Elaine had fought cancer with quiet strength, and peace had been her final wish for me. But this wasn't peace, it was cowardice. Dylan leaned back, smug now, letting Lena's plea carry his defense. "See, Frank," he said, "even your daughter thinks you're overreacting. You've got to stop being so sensitive. People laugh, then they move on." I felt the room closing in. My own daughter couldn't bring herself to acknowledge the truth, and Dylan was using her fear of confrontation as a shield. My disappointment was heavier than anger. I realized that nothing I said would pierce his arrogance or her hesitation. I left quietly, offering Lena a kiss on the forehead before walking out the door. She clung to my arm for a moment as if to apologize without words, then let go. Dylan didn't rise from his chair. He just watched me with a smirk that said he thought he had won. The following week, the whispers grew louder. At church, a man patted my back and said he admired my courage in tough times. At the grocery store, a neighbor offered me coupons, hinting that they might help me stretch my budget. Even when I volunteered more at the food bank, hauling boxes and dropping off donations, people seemed to interpret my efforts as desperation rather than generosity. The narrative Dylan had spun was sticking, and I was powerless to scrape it off. I met Ruth at her office downtown, her desk stacked with files. She adjusted her glasses and looked me in the eye. "Frank, I know you wanted to settle this quietly, but my advice is different now. If Dylan forged that loan, he won't stop. We need evidence. Don't confront him again. Let's gather proof, step by step, so when this goes public, there's no escape for him." I nodded, though the thought of waiting gnawed at me. Still, she was right. To act too soon would be to lose. I had to be deliberate, patient, like a man playing chess with someone who thought that the game was checkers. That night, I sat alone at my kitchen table, the house dark except for the lamp over the documents spread before me. Old tax returns, trust papers, property deeds, everything that mattered. I sorted them carefully, marking places where Dylan might try to dig his claws. The refrigerator hummed in the background, steady and unbothered, while the weight of my failure pressed against my chest. I had tried to confront him with reason. I had given Lena the chance to see clearly. Both efforts had collapsed into silence and denial. Dylan wasn't going to stop mocking me. He wasn't going to stop scheming, and my daughter wasn't ready to defend me. The early attempt at reconciliation had ended not in peace, but in deeper isolation. I understood now. Dylan believed I was powerless. He thought my quiet meant weakness. What he didn't realize was that silence can be a weapon, one I was preparing to sharpen. The luxury hotel's ballroom gleamed with polished marble floors and ceiling-high windows that reflected the Minneapolis skyline. Chandeliers glittered like frozen fire above the stage where Dylan paced, microphone in hand, his tailored suit cut to perfection. It was his biggest event yet, a real estate investor conference designed to attract new capital, impress city officials, and burnish his reputation as a rising star. Banners with his company's logo lined the walls, and a row of television cameras framed the back of the room. I sat near the middle of the audience, not because I wanted to, but because Lena had begged me. "Just come to support him," she'd said. "It's important." Against my better judgment, I agreed, telling myself I would sit quietly, clap politely, and go home. I had no intention of stepping into the spotlight. Dylan began his keynote with his usual charm. He spoke about market growth, property acquisitions, and his vision for transforming Minneapolis neighborhoods into luxury communities. His voice carried the confidence of someone who believed his own mythology. The crowd leaned in, scribbling notes, nodding at every grand claim. But then, as always, he couldn't resist. His grin widened, and he shifted from numbers to storytelling. "Now, let me tell you something about family," he said. "Family is important, but it can also be a lesson. My father-in-law is here today, Frank Whitaker." He gestured toward me and dozens of eyes turned in my direction. Dylan's tone sharpened. "Frank has nothing to his name. He's a simple man, no pension, no assets, just living off the goodwill of those around him. He's proof that if you don't take risks, you end up with nothing." The words landed like stones hurled across the ballroom. Some people laughed awkwardly, others frowned, uncomfortable. I saw a city official glance at me, then back at Dylan, as if silently questioning his judgment. Smartphones lifted discreetly, the cameras at the back rolled on. In that moment, something broke inside me. For years, I had endured Dylan's mockery. I had swallowed his insults, let his lies settle in the air without contest. But this was different. This was not a private jab or a cruel joke at a party. This was public record, broadcast into microphones and captured on video. My silence had allowed him to build his story over me like scaffolding on a ruin, but silence now would mean surrendering my name entirely. I rose slowly from my chair. The movement itself hushed the room. Conversations cut off mid-sentence, the laughter died, and even Dylan paused. My knees felt steady as I walked toward the center aisle, then turned to face him. "You're wrong," I said, my voice low but clear enough to carry. You've built your image on lies. You've mocked me for years to make yourself look taller, but you're standing on borrowed ground. The truth has a way of finding its stage, and when it does, no microphone will be big enough to hide behind. A ripple ran through the audience. Some leaned forward. Others raised their phones higher, recording. Dylan's confident smirk flickered, but he forced a laugh. "Frank, come on. Don't be dramatic. Everyone knows you're just an old man bitter about the past. Let's not spoil the evening with outbursts." I met his eyes and held them. This isn't an outburst. This is a warning. Oi! The silence stretched. For a moment, the entire ballroom existed in the space between his pride and my truth. Dylan's jaw tightened. He tried to wave me off, telling the crowd not to mind, framing me as a cranky relative, but the audience was no longer laughing. They whispered, they exchanged looks, they filmed. I turned without another word and walked out of the ballroom. The heavy doors closed behind me, muting the sound of Dylan's desperate attempt to recover his rhythm. In the lobby, I inhaled deeply, the air cooler and calmer than inside. My heart beat hard, but not with shame, with relief. For the first time, I had pushed back, and the world had witnessed it. As I left the hotel and stepped into the night, I knew there was no going back. Dylan had escalated the feud into a public spectacle, but he had also given me something powerful, the stage, and when the time came, I would not waste it. The house was quiet when I returned from the conference, but the silence carried weight. I set my keys on the counter and sank into the worn recliner by the window. For hours I stayed there, staring at the street lamps flickering outside, my mind replaying Dylan's words in front of that ballroom full of strangers. His voice had been sharp, deliberate, stripping me down not as a man but as a symbol of failure. For the first time in years, I didn't just feel insulted, I felt erased. I rose eventually and walked to the bookshelf where old photo albums sat stacked in faded leather. I opened one at random. Elaine's smile stared back at me, radiant in a picture taken on our 25th wedding anniversary. Her hair was short then, already thinned by the treatments, but her eyes still held that fire I loved. I could almost hear her laugh as I traced the edge of the photograph with my finger. "You wanted me to live quietly," I whispered. "But would you want me to let him bury me alive?" Elaine's words echoed in my memory. "Keep your heart light. Don't let money change the way people see you." I had obeyed. For years I carried that vow like a torch in the dark. But there was another part of her I remembered too. The steel in her spine when someone tried to take advantage. The way she once told me, "Frank, peace doesn't mean surrender. It means knowing when to stand." The phone rang, pulling me back. Ruth's voice was crisp on the line. "Frank, we have a problem," she said. "The forged loan wasn't a one-time stunt. I've tracked attempts through 2 other shell applications. If Dylan is behind them, and I strongly suspect he is, he's escalating. If we don't move quickly, you could find yourself tied up in legal knots that take years to undo." I gripped the phone tighter. "You're saying silence makes me complicit." "I'm saying silence gives him room to grow bolder," she replied. "I've gathered enough to start proceedings. But it's your choice. Do you want to continue protecting your privacy, or are you ready to fight openly?" Her words pressed on me long after we hung up. The next evening, Lena came by. She looked tired, her eyes shadowed by the fallout from Dylan's speech. She sat at my kitchen table, twisting her wedding ring nervously. "Dad, please," she said. "Let's just let this go. Dylan gets carried away, but fighting him will tear us apart. People will talk. The family will be ruined. Isn't peace worth more than pride?" I listened carefully, watching her face. She was my daughter, my only child, and yet she couldn't see that her husband's arrogance was consuming her piece by piece. "Lena," I said gently, "you think I care about pride. I care about truth. Dylan's lies aren't just hurting me. They'll hurt you too. You're already living in his shadow." Her lips trembled, but she shook her head. "I just don't want to lose both of you." When she left, my heart ached. But the ache was different this time. It wasn't weakness, it was clarity. If I did nothing, Dylan's voice would swallow mine entirely. Worse, it would swallow hers. That night, I laid out every document I owned across the table: deeds, trust papers, the records of the software sale, investment statements, all the things I had hidden for years behind shell companies and legal walls. The fortune Elaine and I had built wasn't just money. It was proof of a life lived with discipline and sacrifice. Proof that the man Dylan mocked as poor had worked hard enough to secure more than Dylan could imagine. I sat in the glow of the lamp, staring at the neat stacks of paper, and I felt the decision crystallize. For years I had lived as if the truth were a burden too heavy for the world to see. But the real burden was silence. Dylan thought he had beaten me because I hadn't fought back. He mistook patience for weakness. I knew then that my path had forked. One way led to continued humiliation, my dignity chipped away until nothing remained. The other led to exposure, to risk, to a fight that would burn bridges but reclaim my name. I closed my eyes and pictured Elaine again. This time I didn't see her fragile in a hospital bed. I saw her as she had been in her youth, strong, decisive, the woman who stood by me when no one believed I could turn wrenches into software code. She would not have let Dylan win. She would have told me to stand. When I opened my eyes, the choice was clear. I would no longer remain silent. I would gather my evidence, prepare my proof, and when the moment came, I would reveal everything. Dylan wanted a stage. Well, I would take it from him. By the time dawn seeped through the curtains, I was still at the table, but the weight on my chest had shifted. It was no longer the weight of shame, it was the weight of resolve. The conference had ended, but the echoes of that ballroom refused to fade. Within hours, short clips from Dylan's speech and my interruption were circulating online. Someone had captured the moment he called me a lesson in failure, followed by my quiet stand against his lies. By the next morning, the video had spread across local news feeds. Headlines described Dylan as arrogant and disrespectful, while others framed me as the humiliated father-in-law who finally spoke. The fallout hit Dylan faster than I expected. Several investors who had promised to meet him the following week abruptly canceled, citing schedule conflicts. A developer he had been courting for months pulled out of negotiations altogether. I even saw a segment on the evening news where a reporter questioned whether Dylan's flashy persona masked deeper instability. For the first time, the shine on his carefully built reputation was beginning to dull. At home, Lena bore the brunt of the storm. She called me late one night, her voice trembling. "Dad, everyone is talking. My friends keep sending me the video. I don't know what to say to them. Why did you have to do it there, in public?" Her words cut deep. "Because he left me no choice," I said softly. "He mocked me in front of hundreds of people, Lena. He's been mocking me for years, and now it's on record." She sighed heavily. "Dylan says you set him up. He says you wanted to embarrass him so people wouldn't take him seriously. He swears the media is twisting everything." I closed my eyes. "He's lying to you again. Deep down, you know it." But she wasn't ready to admit it. She ended the call quickly, torn between loyalty to her husband and love for her father. That night, I sat staring at the darkened window, feeling more alone than I had in years. The whispers grew sharper in my own circles. At church the following Sunday, some parishioners avoided eye contact altogether, as though unsure whether to comfort me or keep their distance. A few offered quiet words of support, but most just looked on with pity, their silence louder than any sermon. It struck me how quickly people latch on to a narrative, how the story of a poor old man mocked by his son-in-law was easier to believe than the truth. Ruth called me into her office midweek. She spread a folder across her desk, her nails tapping the paper as she spoke. "This is working in your favor," she said. "Dylan's reputation is unraveling by his own hand. Investors are spooked, and the more he talks, the worse it gets. My advice? Do nothing rash. Let his pride eat him alive while we quietly build the case." I looked down at the documents she'd gathered, the fraudulent loan attempts, the forged notary signatures, the financial trail that hinted at Dylan's schemes. Each page was a piece of a puzzle, one that painted a clearer picture of his intent. Yet the thought of bringing it all to light made my stomach turn. Exposing him would mean exposing Lena's life, her marriage, her vulnerability. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table again, the same place where I had made my decision days before. The lamp cast long shadows across the wood, and the silence pressed hard against my ears. I thought of Elaine. I thought of Lena as a child, running barefoot through the backyard, laughing in the summer light. I wondered how it had all come to this, how the man she had chosen had turned our family into a battlefield. I felt the guilt like a stone in my chest. Every step I took toward exposing Dylan was a step toward breaking my daughter's world apart. But every step I didn't take allowed his lies to grow stronger, his schemes bolder. There was no path left untouched by pain. By the end of that long night, I understood something Ruth had hinted at, but never said outright. Truth always carries consequences. It doesn't fall neatly into place without breaking what surrounds it. Dylan would be broken by it, yes, but so would Lena in ways I couldn't yet predict. And I would have to live with the knowledge that my choice to reveal the truth was both salvation and destruction. Still, the decision had been made. I would not retreat. The tide was turning, and even if it carried us all into uncharted waters, I would let it rise. The days after the conference unfolded like aftershocks from an earthquake. Everywhere I went, I felt eyes on me, curious, pitying, or cautious. Dylan's arrogance had turned our private struggle into public gossip. But instead of shrinking further into myself, I felt something else stirring. It wasn't anger anymore, it was determination. I began each morning at the kitchen table, not with coffee and the newspaper, but with stacks of paper spread before me. Old investment ledgers, trust documents, bank statements, and the papers from the software sale Elaine and I had guarded so carefully. I had hidden these things for years, convinced that silence was protection. Now, sorting through them, I realized they were more than records. They were proof of who I truly was, of the work and sacrifice that Dylan had tried to erase with a smirk and a microphone. There was a rhythm to it. Make copies, organize folders, highlight details that connected back to Dylan's schemes. Each page I touched seemed to strip away another layer of the falsehood he had painted over me. I was not the man he claimed, not the pauper hobbling on family charity. I was a builder, a provider, a man who had lived quietly but not empty. Ruth met me midweek at her office. Her desk was a battlefield of legal pads and binders, but her eyes were steady. She studied the documents I handed her, nodding slowly. "This is solid, Frank," she said, "but don't think of it only as defense. You have the chance to control the narrative. If Dylan dragged this into the public square, then that's where we'll finish it. But timing is everything." She tapped her pen against the calendar on her desk. "There's a community charity banquet in 2 weeks. He'll be there, guaranteed. Those events feed his ego. If you're ready, that could be the moment." Her confidence steadied me, but later that day I drove out to the cemetery. Elaine's grave sat beneath a willow tree, the branches bent low as though listening. I knelt beside the stone, brushing away a cluster of fallen leaves. The air smelled faintly of rain, and the earth was damp beneath my knees. "I don't know if I'm doing the right thing," I whispered. "You wanted peace, not spectacle, but I can't let him bury our life under lies. If I stay silent, then everything we built dies with me. Forgive me, Elaine, but I have to stand." The wind stirred, rustling the branches above me. I closed my eyes and let the sound fill the silence between us. When I rose, I felt steadier than before, as though she had heard me. That evening, Lena stopped by unexpectedly. She carried tension in her shoulders, her eyes tired from sleepless nights. We sat in the living room, where the afternoon light slanted across the carpet. She didn't defend Dylan this time, not fully. "Dad," she said, "something's off. Investors are backing away. He's been more short-tempered lately. I don't know what to make of it." I didn't press her. Instead, I just listened. For the first time, she wasn't shielding Dylan with blind loyalty. She was questioning, even if only in small cracks. I could see the strain in her face, the hesitation in her voice. She wasn't ready to stand with me, but she wasn't standing entirely against me anymore either. That was enough for now. After she left, I stood in front of the mirror in my bedroom. I straightened my tie, adjusted the lapels of my jacket, and looked at the reflection staring back. For too long, I had seen only weariness in those eyes, only defeat in those lines. Now, I saw something else. Resolve. The weight of years had not broken me. The lies had not erased me. I whispered the words to myself, testing them on my tongue, steady and firm. It's time. For the first time, I believed it. The quiet man Dylan thought he could humiliate into nothingness was gone. In his place stood someone ready to reclaim his voice, his dignity, and the legacy he and Elaine had built. The stage was set. All that remained was to step onto it. The banquet hall glittered with lights, its chandeliers casting golden circles over rows of round tables draped in white linen. Waiters moved gracefully between the guests, refilling glasses and setting down plates of salmon and roast vegetables. At the far end, a stage gleamed with polished wood, backed by a banner bearing the name of the community charity. This was the night Dylan had chosen to repair his reputation, and he treated it as though it were his coronation. I sat near the center of the hall, hands folded on my lap, watching him work the crowd. He shook hands, slapped backs, and leaned close to whisper things into the ears of donors who laughed a little too loudly at his remarks. His suit was expensive, his smile even more so, but behind it all, I could see the twitch of nerves. The fallout from the conference still clung to him. Tonight was his attempt to scrub it clean. When the time came for speeches, Dylan strutted onto the stage with a microphone in hand. The lights picked up the sharp angles of his face as he launched into his performance. He spoke of vision and resilience, of how the city needed leaders who could take risks where others hesitated. The words rang hollow to me, but I could see people nodding, letting themselves be pulled along by his practiced confidence. Then he made the mistake I knew he would. His grin turned sly, and his eyes sought me out in the crowd. And of course, he said, we should never forget the value of humility. My father-in-law is here tonight. Frank, you're a good reminder of what happens when a man plays it safe. A simple life, a quiet life, nothing wrong with that. But in the end, it's the bold who build legacies. Polite chuckles fluttered through the room, but they died quickly. The jab had landed awkwardly. People remembered the conference. They remembered how far he had pushed it before. Dylan pressed on, thinking himself clever, but I felt something shift in the air. When his speech ended, Ruth gave me a slight nod. My heart thudded hard against my ribs as I rose from my chair. The MC, surprised, handed me the microphone. Conversations quieted, and I walked slowly to the stage, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes. Dylan smirked, confident I would falter. Thank you, I began, my voice steady. I wasn't planning to speak tonight, but since my name was mentioned, I'd like to share a different story. The hall hushed. Forks paused midair. I held the microphone with one hand and reached into the leather folder Ruth had placed at my table. For many years, I chose a quiet life. My late wife and I built something together, and I guarded it carefully. Some mistook that quiet for emptiness. They thought silence meant weakness, that humility meant poverty. Tonight, I'd like to correct that story. I lifted a document high enough for those near the front to see. Years ago, I founded a small software company right here in Minneapolis. After years of work, we sold it to a national firm. With those proceeds, I invested carefully. Real estate, stocks, community projects. My wife and I never flaunted it, but we built a fortune, not for show, but for legacy. Gasps rippled through the room. I continued, pulling out more papers, photographs, financial records. Today, the trust we created is valued at $30 million. Not pennies in a jar, not charity tossed into a collection box, but 30 million. Managed, accounted for, and real. The silence was absolute for a moment, heavy as stone. Then whispers spread, building like a wave. Heads turned toward Dylan, whose smirk had collapsed into a frozen mask. His color drained under the stage lights. I looked at him briefly before addressing the room again. Humility doesn't mean nothingness. A quiet man is not an empty man. My fortune doesn't define me, but neither do his lies. Tonight, I stand here not for pride, but for truth. My wife deserved that. My daughter deserves that. and I will not let falsehood carry the day." The applause started slowly, then grew until it filled the hall. People rose to their feet, clapping not in frenzy, but in respect. The camera swung away from Dylan and toward me, capturing the moment his story cracked apart. I handed the microphone back and stepped off the stage. My heart pounded, but my steps were even. I wasn't triumphant. I wasn't gloating. I was simply free. Behind me, Dylan remained on stage, eyes darting, searching for some rope to pull himself out of the pit he had dug. But there was none. In that moment, his empire of words crumbled in silence, while the truth stood solid at last. The morning after the banquet, I woke to a phone buzzing endlessly on the nightstand. Friends, neighbors, even people I hadn't spoken to in years were calling, sending messages, forwarding links to news clips. Headlines blared across local outlets. Quiet father-in-law, stuns crowd with $30 million revelation. Community hero reclaims dignity at charity banquet. And, my least favorite, but perhaps the most accurate, Dylan Price exposed. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee, scrolling through the coverage. Reporters described me as calm, steady, a man who had endured mockery with patience until the truth could no longer be hidden. I didn't feel like a hero. I simply felt relieved. The burden of silence was gone. For years, I had carried the weight of concealing what Elaine and I had built, and Dylan had weaponized that silence against me. Now, the truth was in the open. Dylan's world unraveled quickly. By noon, investors who had once flocked to him were issuing statements distancing themselves from his company. A major bank withdrew a line of credit. Social media was merciless. Memes mocking his arrogance, clips replaying his frozen expression as the documents were unveiled. He had always thrived on attention. Now, the spotlight burned him. Lena came to me that afternoon. She looked pale, shaken. For the first time in years, her defenses were gone. She sat across from me, her voice breaking. "Dad, I didn't know." I believed him. I thought you were just too proud to ask for help. I reached across the table, taking her hand gently. "You wanted to believe in your husband." "That's not a sin, Lena, but the truth has a way of revealing itself. Don't blame yourself for his choices." Tears slipped down her cheeks. "He lied to me, to everyone. I don't even know who I married anymore. You'll have to decide what you can live with," I said softly. "But know this, you haven't lost me. I'll always be here." She nodded, and in that moment, something between us mended. The wedge Dylan had driven deep into our family began to loosen. In the days that followed, Dylan vanished from public view. Rumors spread of lawsuits, of fraud investigations, of partnerships collapsing. The man who once strutted across stages now hid behind closed doors. Pride had been his fortress, but once it cracked, nothing held him up. For me, life returned to its quieter rhythm. I continued volunteering at the food bank, this time without whispers about being the poor old man. Neighbors greeted me differently now, not with pity, but with respect. Some even asked for advice, treating me as though I had always been a man of wisdom rather than a subject of gossip. Still, I didn't flaunt the fortune. Elaine and I had built it not for spectacle, but for stability and generosity. Now, freed from secrecy, I found ways to use it meaningfully. I set up scholarships at the local community college. I funded a small park renovation in Elaine's name. Each act felt like weaving her memory into the fabric of the city she loved. One evening, I walked to her grave again. The willow branches swayed gently, and the last light of day lingered on the horizon. "We did it, Elaine," I whispered. I kept our promise to live quietly, but when the time came, I stood. "I hope you're proud." A breeze stirred, and though I couldn't hear her voice, I felt her presence, steady, approving. As weeks passed, I thought often about what had happened. I realized that truth, once revealed, is not just about clearing a name, it is about freeing the soul. Dylan's downfall was not my victory. It was his own pride collapsing under its weight. My triumph was simpler. I could walk into any room without bowing my head. In the end, the lesson was clear. Pride built on lies is fragile, destined to crumble when pressed. But dignity built on truth endures, no matter how long it waits in silence. I had spent years quiet, mistaken for weak. Yet when the truth finally spoke, it needed no defense. It stood taller than any lie. On a cool evening weeks later, I strolled through the park Elaine had once loved. Children played on the swings, their laughter carrying in the wind. The sky blushed orange with sunset, and I felt a quiet smile spread across my face. I was not triumphant, not boastful. I was at peace. For me, that was enough. In the end, every story of pride and humiliation, of silence and revelation, reminds us of a truth as old as time. What is built on lies can never stand forever. It may glitter for a season, it may command applause and admiration for a while, but beneath the surface it crumbles with every false word and every hollow performance. The moment truth steps forward, no matter how quietly, the illusion collapses under its own weight. There is something profoundly moving about the endurance of quiet dignity. It is often mistaken for weakness, often mocked as passivity, but silence can also be strength, a waiting strength, a patience that refuses to wrestle in the mud until the right moment comes. When that moment arrives, the one who has been silent does not need anger or revenge. The truth itself speaks, and its voice is stronger than any boast. The story here is not one of vengeance, but of liberation. It shows that carrying hidden pain, enduring humiliation, and waiting in the shadows does not mean defeat. It means the seed of truth has been planted, and in its time, it will break through the soil. What others ridicule as emptiness can, in reality, be the ground where quiet resilience takes root. And when it blossoms, it leaves no doubt about where strength truly lies. There is also a lesson about pride. Pride built on appearance, on comparisons, and on the need to step on others to feel tall, is a fragile fortress. The proud man believes himself invincible until the mirror cracks and he sees only his own reflection staring back. Then the applause ceases, the crowd disperses, and he is left with nothing but the weight of his own arrogance. Pride has always been a poor substitute for integrity. On the other side, humility proves itself not as weakness but as clarity. To live without constantly proving oneself, to allow the world to misunderstand while quietly holding on to truth. That is the kind of strength that doesn't bend when storms come. Humility waits, humility outlasts, and when the storm clears, it is the humble who are still standing. The story is also about legacy. Wealth, titles, influence, all of these are fleeting when measured only by what others think. But legacy is measured in truth, in the values that endure when reputations collapse. It is not about how loudly one speaks, but how faithfully one lives. A quiet life can be richer than the grandest spectacle if it is built on honesty, sacrifice, and love. Perhaps the greatest reflection is that freedom comes not from hiding, but from standing in the light. To carry secrets, to bow beneath false accusations, is to live under chains. But the moment truth is revealed, the burden lifts, and peace replaces shame. That peace is not dependent on applause or validation. It comes from within, from knowing that what one is in reality is greater than the lies others tell. Every life will face a choice, to protect dignity even at great cost, or to let it be consumed for the sake of peace that is not real. The story reminds us that silence may protect for a time, but eventually truth demands a voice. When that voice is finally given, it reshapes not only how others see us, but how we see ourselves. And so, the lesson is simple, yet profound. Truth may wait, but it never dies. Dignity may bend, but it does not break. Pride may dazzle, but it will always collapse. And when all else fades, what remains is the quiet strength of one who has chosen to stand, not for revenge, but for freedom. In that quiet strength lies the most enduring legacy of all. These turning points remind us that setting boundaries and valuing ourselves is not just an act of courage, it's the foundation of living with dignity. Now, I'd love to hear from you. What's one lesson from this story that you feel connected to, and how will you apply it in your own life? Let's grow together by sharing our thoughts. If this story resonated with you, drop a 1 in the comments. If not, feel free to leave a 0. Your feedback helps us improve. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that touch the heart and spark reflection. Thank you for watching, and here's to living life with strength, honesty, and authenticity.